23:41. The 911 dispatcher answers a call. A woman's voice, ragged breathing. He attacked me. He grabbed me. I defended myself. The address is a quiet suburban street, a two-story house with a neat lawn and cameras at the entrance. Patrol and ambulance arrive 7 minutes later. In the living room, a man showing no signs of life. On the coffee table, a phone knocked aside, its parts scattered. Nearby, broken glasses. The woman repeats, "He came to pressure me about the baby." Thus begins a case where the romance of messages and flights is stripped down to transactions, timestamps, and traces on skin.
He was 47 and accustomed to schedules that ran like pipelines. Wealth was not an aspiration, but an inherited infrastructure. Contracts, concessions, and discrete partnerships arranged long before he learned to sign his name in a practiced hand. His father built the empire by stacking risk on logistics and buying time with cash, then sent his son to Oxford to learn how to speak about power as if it were governance. The son returned fluent in discretion, trained to convert favors into equity and attention into silence. In photographs, he looked finished, a tailored line of suits, measured posture, a watch that marked hours other people worked for. What he valued publicly was legacy. What he feared privately was noise.
The marriage arrived as an introduction at a winter reception and hardened into permanence by spring. People whispered about calculation, but the household that formed was warmer than gossip permitted. Planned breakfasts, long flights taken together, a habit of sending postcards even when calling would do. A son was born, and with him a practical center of gravity. The couple discovered they worked best in motion, stitching school calendars to shareholder meetings and holidays to site visits. Between them, the rules were simple: protect the boy, guard the name, keep emotion from breaching into scandal. If there were compromises, they were internal and never published.
They chose to live much of the year in the United States because it simplified negotiations and complicated scrutiny. In American suburbs, he could be a father on a sideline instead of a figure in a convoy. The house was large but precise, designed to keep life on rails. Gym at dawn, calls in a glass-walled study, dinners that began on time. Security existed as routine rather than theater. Cameras, a driver on retainer, an attorney who hated surprises. When travel stacked too closely, he cut days into compartments and moved through them as if each were a deal with terms. It worked until it didn't. He believed in clean ledgers and thought feelings could be reconciled the same way. In the office, that was mostly true. He was the man who could turn a stalled negotiation by changing a clause and a tone, someone partners trusted when uncertainty threatened to go public. He did not improvise, he calibrated. If a problem cost money, it was, by definition, solvable. If a problem cost reputation, it was, by definition, urgent. That framework would later fail him in the only arena where money records poorly: private decisions made in rooms without minutes. Dubai was supposed to be a pause between transactions, a family holiday shaped by sun and manageable spectacle. He knew the city well, who to call for reservations, which views satisfied guests who asked for something unforgettable. The meeting was incidental at first, a tourist off course near a mall, a request for directions that lengthened into company. She spoke in the American cadence of someone used to explaining budgets to herself. He answered with the manner of a host who has never been denied a table. By evening, he had shown her a skyline designed to make distance look like possibility. What he saw was uncomplicated attention. What she saw was an exit with amenities. She talked about shifts and debt and a city that promised everything in neon but delivered slowly and with interest. He heard gratitude, then reliance, then the outline of a story he could fund without touching his core life. He had helped men restructure assets across borders. Helping a person across a smaller border felt unthreatening. It was an error of category. The boundary he crossed was not jurisdictional, but personal. After she flew home, their contact did not fade the way holiday acquaintances do.
Messages stretched into the late hours, when his house slept and hers turned noisy with neighbors returning from work. Photographs replaced descriptions, then itineraries replaced photographs. He booked flights the way he booked options, quietly, with contingencies, never in his own name when secrecy was the point rather than humility. On paper, the trips looked like diligence. In practice, they were something else. He convinced himself the difference mattered only to him. At home, he maintained the tempo that had always protected him. He went to games. He answered school emails with the brevity of a man who appreciated logistics. He praised teachers and funded a local program for science equipment, not for press, but because competence pleased him. To the people who needed him to be reliable, he was. The discrepancy lived in the margins. Calendar entries described as meetings. A suitcase left near the door because the driver would arrive at 6. Double lives are not ornate at the beginning, they are just slightly misnamed. He did not call what he felt love, because love implied submission, and submission contradicted his training. He called it relief, then novelty, then discretion. He told himself this made him careful. In truth, it made him confident. The architecture of his days, staff, attorneys, encryption, encouraged that feeling. If he could move millions without a ripple, he could move hours the same way. The risk he discounted was the only one that can't be outsourced, another person's decision under pressure. His father had taught him to anticipate the next demand before it arrived. In business, that meant over-collateralizing. In family, that meant never letting conflict escalate to witness. He believed he was honoring both lessons by keeping compartments sealed. But secrecy behaves like leverage. It magnifies consequence. Each quiet flight made the next easier to schedule and harder to explain. Each gift simplified a moment and complicated the future. He was not hiding an affair so much as engineering a delay. By the end of that year, his routines had absorbed the deviation. Assistants guarded time blocks without knowing what they protected. A second phone lived in a drawer that no one opened but him. The woman he once helped find a corridor in a foreign mall now had a corridor into his private life. He had not tested the exits. He had not imagined the alarms. He assumed that when it became necessary, he would settle accounts and return the balance to zero. What he underestimated was the velocity at which private choices convert into public crises. He had systems for everything except refusal. He had contracts for everything except consequence. The life he built was engineered to survive market shocks and legal storms, but not a single decision made in a small room between two people with no counsel present. Chapter 1 ends where his certainty begins to fail, with a man who has never missed a payment stepping into an obligation that cannot be paid away. She lived by a calendar that bent around other people's needs. Tips filled the gaps that wages left open, and rent came due with the same stubbornness every month. She was not naive about class. She measured it in waiting time, in how quickly a manager apologized, in how often a flight changed price after she clicked refresh. His attention entered that economy like a wire transfer, clean and immediate. He booked tables without asking, arranged cars that actually arrived, and made travel feel less like an obstacle course and more like a corridor. She did not mistake generosity for permanence, but she recognized momentum when she felt it. Their messages shifted tone with the precision of a dimmer. At first the exchange was geography, views, restaurants, comparative weather. Then logistics took over. Flight numbers, hotel confirmations, a shared map pin that came with reassurance. Photographs replaced context because context slowed them down. In those frames, he looked lighter and she looked closer to the life she said she wanted. The distance between them shrank until it lived only in the hours before boarding. He traveled on weekdays when families blended into the city and questions were rarer. He learned which airports turned discreet the moment a platinum card appeared, and which concierge understood non-disclosure as a service, not a form. She learned how to pack a life into a carry-on and pretend a weekday morning was a Sunday. The pattern became simple: a check-in message, 2 days of controlled remove from the world, then a re-entry that landed them on opposite sides of a secret. Nothing about the cadence looked dramatic from the outside. Everything about it was consequential from within. He financed every moment as if underwriting risk. Dinners ended with a signature. Flights ended with a car. Departures ended with a promise that could be met by money. For her, each proof of solvency looked like proof of intent, because in daily life, the two often travel together. For him, each transfer was a stabilizer, ballast to keep the vessel steady. Gifts were not declarations, they were tools. It was a language both understood differently and discovered too late. The first serious strain arrived as a sentence she typed 3 times and sent once. The words were ordinary and final, stripped of decoration. It was late, and the message landed on his second phone while the house where he slept stayed dark and still. He read it twice, then looked at the schedule in the morning the way he looked at markets when weather threatened supply routes. He did not answer immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well what acknowledgement would require. Delay felt like a strategy until it converted into a decision. When he did reply, it was in numbers and arrangements. There was a clinic with discrete parking. There were dates that fit between quarterly reviews and the school spring break. He wrote about options and support as if solutions came in tiers. She wrote back about choice and consequence as if the question could not be averaged. Both were, in their own ways, precise. Precision did not align them. It set them on parallel tracks. Money arrived with a subject line that said less than it meant. It was enough to change a few months and not enough to change a life. She told herself the transfer recognized the scale of what she faced, then told herself it did not. She booked consultations she might not attend and a hotel she could cancel for free. When she walked through the city afterward, she saw 2 versions of herself in every reflective surface and did not know which one could bear staying. He believed this was an expensive pause. He told himself that difficult choices reward decisiveness, and that the people who suffer most are those who attempt to live in both outcomes at once. He planned a day to be present for the procedure and a night to be absent for the story he would tell at home. He framed it as containment, not abandonment. The calculation carried the signature of his training: control the window, close the file, protect the perimeter. It was clinical and, in the private realm, inadequate. Her reversal did not arrive with a speech. It arrived as a blank on the clinic calendar, then as a quiet text sent at a time that made it impossible for him to call. She wrote that she could not proceed and that she would figure it out, which sounded like independence and felt like escalation. He reread the message while sitting under a painting that belonged to another era of his family, and the weight of inheritance felt less like continuity than gravity. For the first time, he imagined not the cost of a problem, but the broadcast of one. Reputation moved from abstraction to event. Negotiation replaced romance with the inevitability of a weather system. She asked for security and time, and a plan that did not treat her body as a ledger entry. He asked for privacy and time, and a plan that did not crack the glass of his other life. She named a number that accounted for years, not weeks. He countered with a number that accounted for silence, not futures. Neither proposal solved the part the other refused to price. The messages that followed were longer and colder. Screenshots of transfers sat next to paragraphs about responsibility. There were lines about lawyers that were meant as information and read as threats. The word family appeared more often and carried different reference depending on who wrote it. Their shared language fractured into terms that could be argued by strangers in a room with microphones. What they had built in private began to acquire witnesses. He chose in-person over text because real decisions, he believed, belonged to rooms. She agreed because rooms have doors, and she wanted one to close behind a solution.
The meeting was scheduled in a gap between flights, inside a neighborhood where deliveries arrive without questions and neighbors wave without names. He marked the time in his calendar as a meeting with initials that had no meaning to anyone but him. She cleaned surfaces that didn't need cleaning and left water on the table, as if hospitality could still moderate an outcome already leaning toward fracture. By the morning of the appointment, they had both revised their stories to make endurance sound like strategy. He told himself that responsible men keep storms from crossing property lines. She told herself that people who are not heard raise their volume. Between those positions sat facts that would not bend: biology, timelines, disclosure, and the simple arithmetic of who pays for what when love has exited the room. Chapter 2 ends at the doorbell, where two different definitions of protection arrive at the same address and only one will survive the conversation. He arrived between 1356 and 1405, the window narrowed by a rideshare receipt and a neighborhood camera that caught the reflection of his jacket in a parked SUV. The driver's app shows a drop-off one cul-de-sac away, a common tactic to avoid linking a plate to a specific doorway. From there, his phone recorded a brief step count spike consistent with a short walk. He carried a slim document folder under one arm, the practical kind that keeps paper from becoming story. The weather was unremarkable, dry air and a thin brightness that makes surfaces read as cleaner than they are. The doorbell chime registered on her smart speaker history at 1407. Inside, she had staged the room to look like a conversation would be enough. 2 glasses of water on the low table, a coaster already damp from a test pour, the television muted but glowing as if company. She powered her phone to silent and placed its screen down within reach, a small assertion of control. The blinds were angled for privacy rather than light, cutting the room into even stripes. She had wiped the countertop twice and moved a chair 2 inches to the left without registering why. Preparation is a ritual. It fills the space where fear would otherwise sit. At the threshold, there was a beat in which they both performed normalcy. He looked toward the corners where cameras might be and did not find any obvious lenses. She gestured to the table with the economy of a host who wants a meeting to start and end on time. Their distance began as polite and measurable: a coffee table, a folder, an agreement that this would be civil. He set the folder down without opening it, signaling that tone precedes terms. She remained standing for a second longer than custom requires, signaling that this would not be quick. The conversation opened in the language of logistics, because logistics feel safer than motive. He spoke about arrangements and support, as if the right sequence could dissolve the problem back into calendar squares. She spoke about autonomy and futures, as if the problem could not be reduced without losing something essential. He used numbers as scaffolding, not as threat. She used time as pressure, not as ultimatum. Neither heard the reassurance the other believed they were offering. He reached a point where words alone felt inadequate and slid the folder toward the center. Inside were clean printouts of transfers, a timetable, and a final figure scrawled at the bottom of a page with the confidence of someone used to closing. The paper carried the smell of fresh toner. The corners were still sharp. She did not pick it up. The space between presentation and acceptance lengthened, and with it the idea that anything here could be resolved by proof of capacity. Money is persuasive when the choice is optional. Here it was not. Her answer arrived as refusal arranged into facts. She would not erase a decision already embodied, and she would not treat her future as an accounting problem. She said it not as defiance but as boundary, the voice even, the hands still. He heard exposure in every contour of that stance. Not a request, not an exchange, a path leading outside the house and into a life that could read headlines. He recalculated without moving, a habit learned in rooms where hesitation is expensive. Calm, for a moment, held. Small details began to harden the air. His watch vibrated a calendar reminder he dismissed without looking, but the gesture was noted.
Her eyes tracked the folder and then returned to his posture rather than his face, measuring angles, not expressions. The condensation ring from her glass widened toward the edge of the coaster and dripped to the table, a quiet stain that would outlast the hour. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, though it did not require adjusting. These are the ordinary movements by which tension reveals itself when words remain level. When he spoke next, the cadence shortened, each sentence trimmed of the softeners that had made earlier trips feel like permission. He returned to reputation and responsibility, to the gravity of a name that sustains more lives than the one attached to it. He believed he was asking for prudence. She heard he was demanding disappearance. The difference is the span across which many private conflicts break into public ones. Neither stepped closer, but proximity shifted anyway. She countered with a number built not from months but from years. Housing, childcare, the practical spine of a life organized around a child. It was less a price than an acknowledgement that outcomes carry maintenance, not just entry fees. He saw in it a lever that, once accepted, could be pulled again. He proposed a figure designed to purchase quiet rather than guarantee care. Both sums were honest to their authors and insufficient to their recipients. The room took on the geometry of an impasse. Air moved from the vent with an audible hiss that had not been noticeable a half-hour earlier. Outside, a delivery truck idled and then rolled away, and with it, the ambient cover that made their sentences feel unrecorded. Inside, two people whose lives had learned different rules about power found themselves at the point where those rules collide. He weighed the cost of disclosure in headlines against the cost of a concession he believed would not be final. She weighed the cost of capitulation against the cost of escalating a fight she had not chosen to stage. He placed a hand on the folder as if to gather the pages and reset the frame. The gesture was tidy and, to him, neutral, the way a meeting leader cues a return to agenda. To her, it read as closure attempted without agreement. She straightened, not in threat, but in refusal to be moved by process. The air between them thickened into the kind of silence that is not empty, but crowded with pending outcomes. In that density, the room ceased to be neutral space and became a sight. By 1429, both had run out of language that felt both accurate and safe. He recalibrated toward finality, assembling the argument that men in his position reach for when containment seems to be slipping. The primacy of family, the sanctity of privacy, the promise of support contingent on compliance. She recalibrated toward insistence, assembling the argument that women in her position reach for when recognition is the first step toward survival. The primacy of choice, the sanctity of truth, the promise of endurance that does not submit to being purchased. They were now speaking across a gap wider than a table could span. The instant before escalation is rarely cinematic. It is a hand adjusting a document, a foot angling for balance, a glance toward a door, as if the door could arbitrate. It is an exhale that has nowhere to settle. It is two stories, each coherent to its author, arriving at the one point where coherence cannot share space. Chapter 3 closes at that edge, the door still shut, the blinds still fixed, the folder still between them, and the line between negotiation and conflict reduced to the width of a gesture. The break began as a correction in distance. He reached to reclaim the folder, and she angled away, not with drama, but with a refusal to let the papers reframe what had already been said. His hand found her forearm in a grip meant to halt rather than harm, the everyday authority of someone used to stopping a meeting with touch. She stiffened and tried to step sideways, the coffee table narrowing options to geometry rather than persuasion. The room, neutral a moment before, registered the change with sudden clarity, the hiss from the vent, the weight of the door, the edge of the counter that had previously been only a line. He attempted to reduce the moment back to administration, guiding rather than seizing, the kind of physical insistence that reads to its author as firm and to its recipient as force. She pivoted toward open space, the kitchen a yard beyond the table,
her free hand searching for balance on a slick surface. The condensation ring she had noticed earlier widened under her palm, turning steadiness into slide. He moved to block her path, not running, not lunging, just arriving where she needed to go. Their bodies, scaled differently and trained for different worlds, met at a distance now measured in angles rather than arguments. The first contact was not decisive. It was a shudder through furniture. A chair tipped and bumped the wall, leaving a soft mark in paint. The folder slipped, pages flaring and landing across the rug like a hurried chronology no longer under editorial control. She braced a shoulder against the counter's corner and felt the sting of pressure more than pain. He reached again, faster this time, less tidy, and her forearm twisted from his hold with the panic-quick strength that comes when exit feels mechanical rather than optional. She grabbed what was closest, because that is how self-preservation operates under pressure. The object had weight without intention, a decor piece chosen for texture, not utility, left on the counter as design. Her grip was poor, her hand was damp, the thing was not built for hands at all. He stepped forward with momentum rather than menace, and the line between warding off and striking blurred in a single motion. What she meant to create was space, what the movement made was contact. The sound that followed was dull rather than sharp, the kind rooms make when something heavy interrupts their arrangement. He faltered, not theatrical, just suddenly without balance, one foot catching on the foot of the tipped chair. Momentum completed what neither had planned. He went backward and sideways, the kind of fall that looks reversible until gravity finishes its work. The corner of the low table met him on its own schedule. The quiet after impact was the loudest thing in the room. She held the object as if it could rewind time, and then placed it down because it could not. He did not rise. She spoke his name once without volume, then knelt and reached for checks learned from videos and posters and the basic human library of what to do when breathing becomes question. There was no response she could trust herself to interpret. She moved the chair aside with the automatic courtesy of someone making space for help. The phone was where she had left it, screen dark and clean. She unlocked it without looking down. The numbers appeared in order, because that is how emergencies standardize panic. She stepped away from him and toward the front door as the call connected, the instinct to introduce oxygen and access to a room that now felt sealed. The voice on the line was calm, and hers was not. She described location before narrative, as training and software both encourage. Then she spoke in facts that sounded like accusations, because facts in crisis often do. She reported a struggle, the presence of a man, the attempt to leave that narrowed into an attempt to resist, the fall, the stillness. She kept her sentences short, because long ones would break. When asked, she confirmed she was alone in the house and that the door was now unlocked. The dispatcher walked her back through the scene, measuring safety first, then proximity, then what help could be offered across a speaker. She did as instructed, touching neck and sternum and counting seconds that answered with nothing she could name. She followed the steps that can convert a room into a clinic, but rooms only convert so far without equipment and hands trained for muscle memory rather than fear. She continued until the dispatcher told her to stop and listen for sirens. She heard them faint at first, that faraway band of sound that tells a neighborhood something has crossed a line. She switched on the porch light though daylight still reached the street, the ritual of signaling embedded from 1,000 televised rescues and a handful of drills. She stood where the threshold could see her and where the room could not swallow her. The air felt both thin and heavy, a contradiction common to minutes that matter too much. In her chest, the rhythm went ahead without her consent. Between the call and the knock, she gathered nothing and explained nothing. She did not touch the papers on the rug or the object on the counter. She did not arrange anything for appearances because appearances had already been replaced by evidence. The house held the record it had just made, the tipped chair, the damp ring on wood, the path carved by panic between table and door. She waited inside that record for people trained to read it.
When the first shadow moved across the frosted glass, she stepped back and raised her hands, not because anyone had asked, but because clarity is a language, and she needed to speak it before words could fail. She stated again, for the line now splitting from phone to doorway, that she had called and why. The room remained as it had become, a place where two stories had collided and only one could continue. Chapter 4 ends at the moment before strangers enter and fix the narrative to clocks, and the private fight becomes a public case with its own gravity.
The first officers treated the room as a map and the woman as a witness to geography. They separated her to the porch and asked for the simple sequence: who entered, what changed, where they stood when the fall happened. Inside, a sergeant walked the visible path from door to table to kitchen and back, narrating distances for the body-worn camera. A medic confirmed what she already knew but would not say out loud, then stepped aside as the scene shifted to evidence. The object on the counter was photographed in place before it was measured and bagged. The chair's fresh scuff on the wall and the damp ring on the wood table were documented like sentences that would later need a translator.
Crime scene technicians built time out of residue. A grid was taped across the rug to record the scatter of paper, each sheet numbered so its position could survive memory. Latent prints were lifted from the document folder and the glass, then from the edge of the counter where she had braced. On his cuff, there were faint fibers consistent with a kitchen towel found near the sink. On her forearm, faint reddish pressure marks sized to a hand. The door was swabbed, the knob dusted, the doorbell plate photographed for touch points. Nothing about the scene read as staged, everything read as interrupted. Medical examiners carried the stillness out under a sheet and left the report for later. Preliminary notes described blunt force trauma consistent with a fall onto furniture, with secondary marks matching a brief struggle. There were no signs of intoxicants and no injuries that suggested prolonged assault. The pattern on his wrist matched the bevel of the table edge, a geometry lesson that replaced speculation with angles. Her skin showed defensive abrasions, small and recent. The language was clinical because it had to be. The implications would be argued elsewhere. Digital clocks began their slow work. The smart doorbell had a motion ping at 14:06 and a ring at 14:07, then a second motion event at 14:30 when she opened the door for air. Inside the home, a voice assistant log captured the chime and a muted music command at 13:55, the last thing she did before pacing. Her phone showed no outgoing calls between 13:40 and 14:32, and then the 911 call, 9 minutes in duration. His phone, recovered from the floor with a cracked screen, registered a calendar alert at 14:25 and no answered calls. A neighborhood camera across the street contributed the reflection of a dark jacket arriving and the flash of emergency lights later. Nothing cinematic, just evidence. Outside the four walls, the story tightened rather than spread. A rideshare record showed a drop 1 block over at 13:56, and a path consistent with a short walk. Hotel keycard data placed him checked in under a secondary business identity since the night before, a common practice when privacy is a goal and explanation is a cost. Airport CCTV had him clearing the concourse alone, no aides, no entourage, no attempt to hide beyond the usual discretion. Bank records confirmed a 5-figure transfer to her account a month prior, with a neutral memo line, and a smaller transfer early that morning, labeled with an internal code only his accountant would understand. Privacy had been purchased in layers. It did not cover this. Interviews rolled forward in a measured cadence. Neighbors described a quiet afternoon. A delivery idled and left. A dog barked twice, then sirens. The building superintendent had no complaints on file for the unit and no record of prior police visits. The woman's employer confirmed she had requested the day off a week earlier, citing a personal appointment. The timing predated any last-minute escalation. Friends described her recent weeks as restless, not reckless. Long walks, short replies, decisions postponed in sentences that trailed off. No one reported threats, everyone recalled tension.
Detectives took the woman's statement in 2 passes, once immediate for triage, and once recorded after she ate and stopped shaking. Her account matched the room more than it matched what either side might wish a clean story to be. She described the grip on her forearm, the pivot to the kitchen, the slide on condensation. She explained the object as the nearest thing with weight, and the motion as an attempt to create space, not harm. When she reached the part where he fell, her sentences shortened again, as if language itself declined to follow.
Forensic timelines are built by subtraction. Technicians overlaid the doorbell's chime with the phone's accelerometer spikes from a brief struggle and the mute click of a television remote, then the sudden stillness that followed. The time from first contact to impact was less than a minute by their count, shorter than almost anyone expects when they imagine arguments that end lives. The interval between impact and the 911 call was longer, but not scandalously so. 1,900 heartbeats, give or take. The chair's track across the rug measured a straight-line scramble rather than a theatrical rearrangement. The facts refused to align with tidy intentions. Intent, however, is not found in dust. Investigators pulled a longer thread through the phones and laptops, assembling a narrative from messages that began as escape and hardened into terms. His words leaned toward discretion and settlement, hers toward recognition and future. The last week tilted into friction, a number named by her, a number countered by him, and a planned conversation to bridge the unpriced gap. In that archive, fear did not look like menace, and anger did not look like planning. The prosecution would later decide what names to give the tones that do not appear on transcripts. By the 3rd day, the case file had more paper than voices. The family liaison notified next of kin with the tact that tries to do enough and cannot. His wife received the news behind a closed door. Their child was spared the details and could not be spared the absence. Her relatives arrived in pairs and asked procedural questions because substance was unbearable. Reporters called and were told nothing beyond time and place. Silence became the only commodity anyone could still control. Charging decisions live at the intersection where facts and statutes shake hands without fully agreeing. The district attorney's office reviewed the forensic summary, the medical preliminaries, the digital reconstruction, and the recorded interview in which she never strayed from her first claim. He grabbed, she resisted, he fell. Self-defense in this jurisdiction requires imminence and proportionality, standards designed for clarity that rarely meet real rooms. The evidence supported a struggle, not a plan. It supported an impact, not an execution. It also supported a meeting she had accepted and a history of monetary leverage neither side denied. Before the week ended, detectives executed a final round of warrants for financials and travel records to close holes defense attorneys look for. Nothing exotic surfaced. No prior domestic calls, no hidden weapons, no rehearsal. What did surface was the architecture of a double life that had tried to remain an arrangement and had become a collision. The file went upstairs with recommendations that avoided absolutes. A grand jury would be asked to speak where individuals could not. She left the station in the company of counsel and the kind of quiet that follows people who have been seen at their smallest distance from disaster. She returned to an apartment that did not yet feel like a crime scene and would never again feel like a home. The tape was gone from the doorway, but the air still held the shape of strangers and procedure. On a table, a rectangle of wood slightly darker than the rest marked where water once pooled, the moment before everything changed. Chapter 5 ends with the notice to appear and the citation of statutes, the line where investigation hands its language to the court and private grief steps into public grammar. Jury selection lasted 3 days because words like self-defense and reputation warp perspectives before evidence ever arrives. The prosecutor framed the case as a death born from control rather than chance, a meeting arranged to purchase compliance that ended when leverage failed. The defense framed it as a narrow corridor where a woman, pressed and cornered, reached for the nearest space and found tragedy instead. Both promised the jury a map made from timestamps, bruises, and messages that sound different when read aloud in a room with microphones. The judge reminded everyone that sympathy is not a statute, and that doubt, to matter, must be reasonable. Then the first exhibit lit the screen. The doorbell log came first, motion at 14:06, chime at 14:07, no exit before sirens. A neighbor's camera added a reflective outline moving toward the stoop and emergency lights later. Nothing dramatic, only the kind of proof jurors trust because machines don't testify. The rideshare receipt anchored his arrival at 13:56, 1 block away, and the phone's step count filled the gap between curb and threshold. The prosecutor emphasized how intention hides in logistics. The defense emphasized how secrecy is not the same as violence. The timeline settled into place like flooring, tight seams, quiet creaks. No one contested the minutes. Forensics followed with the patience of someone paid to teach bone to speak. The medical examiner described a fall onto furniture, a table corner that matched a patterned bruise, and no evidence of extended assault. Photos showed faint compression marks on her forearm and defensive scrapes along the back of his hand. Ordinary signatures of a brief struggle rather than a planned beating. The object from the counter was displayed without spectacle, its weight measured, its edge rounded, its purpose decorative. Capability, the prosecutor said, does not require intention. Contact, the defense replied, does not equal offense. Messages supplied motive in the way courts recognize, incrementally and without poetry. Jurors read his notes about privacy, settlement, and family as perimeter. They read hers about choice, future, and recognition as center. Figures floated between them like bridges proposed and declined. One sum tied to silence, another to years of care. The week before the meeting turned tense in print, but not criminal in tone. The prosecutor argued that coercion need not shout. The defense argued that refusal need not threaten. When she testified, the room shifted from analysis to gravity. She spoke in the same plain register she used with detectives. The grip on her arm, the pivot toward the kitchen, the slip at the counter, the swing intended to clear space. She did not assign him cruelty, she assigned him certainty, the kind that closes doors while calling it prudence. She described the moment after the fall with the precision of someone who has replayed it too often to trust memory. The pause, the name spoken once, the habit of hands checking for breath. She admitted fear more easily than anger. Her words left no place for triumph. The prosecution pressed on the number she named and the number he countered, asking whether this was negotiation or leverage sharpened into threat. She refused the language of threat and repeated the language of boundary. The defense used that refusal to keep the frame on immediacy, imminence, proportionality, the legal verbs that govern the use of force when exit narrows to inches. The jury watched two versions of the same room, one in which money tried to purchase obedience, and one in which a hand on a forearm turned choice into hazard. The judge sustained, overruled, and kept the current from breaking banks. Experts in human factors explained how panic compresses time and enlarges motion. A biomechanical analyst parsed the difference between a blow delivered to punish and a movement made to ward off, mapping joints and arcs until the diagram looked apolitical. The prosecutor asked whether a person with his size and training could have been avoided without force at all. The answer, cautious and qualified, satisfied no one. The defense asked whether a decor object can be a weapon in the absence of intent. The answer circled back to circumstance. The law prefers thresholds to gradients. Real rooms offer gradients. Jury instructions arrived like a second language. The elements of manslaughter, the carve-outs of self-defense, the role of fear when measured against reason. Imminence had to be real, not imagined. Proportionality had to be judged from the vantage point of the moment, not the quiet of the box. The burden sat where the law placed it, and nowhere else. The judge told them to weigh credibility, not character, acts, not lifestyles. The bind was clear. Decide whether a single movement in a crowded minute was protection or crime. Deliberations lasted 19 hours, spread across 2 days, interrupted by sandwiches and one question about the definition of reasonable belief. They asked to see the doorbell log again and the photograph of the table corner. They reread the morning's bank transfer and the afternoon's 911 transcript. Some heard purchase in his offers, others heard responsibility. All saw a woman who called for help within minutes and stayed on the line. They returned without spectacle. The verdict did not accept premeditation and did not grant full immunity. Guilty of manslaughter, the foreperson said, the syllables catching on the first consonant and smoothing out by the last. The acquittal on the higher count landed like air. The conviction on the lesser count landed like weight. In the gallery, Payne had no sides. His wife closed her eyes in a way that looked permanent. Their child, protected from images, could not be protected from this sound. Her shoulders dropped, not in relief, but in the recognition that the room's grammar had ended. Sentencing took place a month later, after reports and arguments dressed loss in numbers. The prosecution asked for the high end, citing the meeting's design and the imbalance of power that preceded the impact. The defense asked for the low end, citing the call to 911, cooperation, lack of history, and the immediacy of fear. The judge spoke of lives braided by secrecy and cut by seconds, of choices that turn households into records. The term fell below the maximum and above mercy, years long enough to count but not to erase. Credit for time served was noted with the same neutrality as case numbers. Outside, statements were brief because language fails usefully at the edge of grief. His family thanked the court and asked for privacy in sentences their lawyers helped craft. Her counsel said they respected the verdict and would review appellate options without promising more. Reporters filled packages with graphics and restraint. The apartment remained leased but uninhabited, a place where evidence had replaced comfort. People who had never met either of them adjusted their opinions to fit the headline. Appeal notices were filed because that is how procedure continues when stories would rather end. Arguments will hinge on instructions and standards, not on sorrow. Perhaps a panel will see a different gradient in the same room, perhaps not. What will not change is the arithmetic that began with a doorbell and closed with a gavel. A man is dead, a woman is convicted, a child grows older in the shadow of a name that once meant only security. The case leaves a lesson that resists slogans. Money can coordinate movement and silence, but it cannot negotiate biology or consequence. Fear can justify force, but it cannot retroactively edit geometry. If you recognize pieces of this shape in your life, escalate to professionals before escalation lives in a room. Mediators, counsel, structured agreements that honor both privacy and personhood. Quiet is not the same as safety. Control is not the same as care. The law arrives last and writes in ink.